Thank you very much. Let me take 1 minute to apologize. I know one word in German, beer. So if you will allow me to speak English for 20 minutes, we will all speak my one German word afterwards, and we will all share a beer. My talk tonight makes a very bold claim. It says there will be a new market leader in fintech in the year 2020, brand new, and you don't even know it. Now, I am not going to talk about fintech. I'm going to ask each and every one of you to insert your market category. So if you make running devices, I will claim there will be a new market leader in 2020 and you don't even know it. Or if you have a cutting board with convenience, there will be a new market leader and you don't even know it. So while my talk will say the words fintech, you should be translating in your mind the same way I translate English to German. Translate fintech to your category, and then this talk will be very relevant for you. So let's get started. Why am I the right person to stand in front of you and say that there will be a disruption in your industry that is so massive that the entire juxtaposition of market leadership will change in 5 short years? It will change. You don't even know who the market leader will be. They probably have not even been started yet. And yet by 2020, they will be the market leader. Why am I the person who has any credibility? Well, I'm not a young man. I have been fighting the tech wars in Silicon Valley for 35 years. And in my 35 years, I've fought many battles, but 3 are memorable to me. The first was the browser wars in the early to mid-90s. I ran strategy for Netscape Communications, and we invented an idea, or we brought to the world a concept that forever changed how we live our lives. And the browser begat the internet, and the internet begat a fundamental change in the way each and every one of us do whatever it is we do every day. The second big battle I had the opportunity to be on the front lines was the smartphone wars. My company implemented the first 6 Android phones in the world. 6 different companies, not 6 phones for one company. We were Android experts and deployed the first 6 ever in the world. And what we did with Android to destroy Nokia, so when those smartphone wars started, Nokia had 64% market share. And by the time we're done, there is no Nokia anymore. They're part of Microsoft. That kind of profound change is what we will be talking about. The most recent battle in which I've engaged is banking. And there is a banking war that is going on, and there is a disintermediation of the horrible service that corporates and individuals are receiving from banks today that will tear apart the underbelly of the banking system as we know it and create an entirely new paradigm by the year 2020. So I've been in the wars. I've seen the fights. I've come out the other end. And in many cases, we came out the other end creating tremendous wealth for other people. A little bit for me, but mostly for other people. And we will talk about how you can do the same thing for yourself, for your customers, and for your shareholders. So let me start with the first big disruption that interested me, and that was art in the Middle Ages. This is a very famous painting, one you might have seen or heard of. It's the Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted by Michelangelo. And it was a massive disruption because art, up until this time, had been predominantly religious-based. It had been painting of God's greatness and the awe-inspiring great things he did for people. It was commissioned, typically by the government and religious leaders. And it was very, very difficult for the common man or the everyday person to ever get to experience or touch. It was very, very difficult to access to the masses. And when one of these disruptions, like Michelangelo did, occurs, it lasted for centuries. So what was the disruption I'm talking about? Well, Michelangelo was a fundamentalist. He believed that you don't need to reach God through an intermediary of the church, that you could directly access God. And I don't want to get religious here, but this was a monumental shift from the way people thought at the time. And he used a platform that was a very unusual platform. He was hired by the Pope and the Vatican to paint this ceiling, and he painted what fundamentally went against church doctrine. Now that's disruption. That's massive disruption. And it was a disruption that lasted through the Middle Ages and the Reformation and beyond. And in this period, you could disrupt a market, and that disruption could last for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, I'm not a great student of art of these older periods. My favorite piece of art is this one. And this is painted by an artist named Banksy. No one really knows who he is. Yet this had the same fundamental power of message as the Sistine Chapel. It was a message that had deep content, that moved people, but it had a very different venue. This is painted on the side of a wall on a brick building in London, and it's accessible to anybody who walks by this building. And anybody, anywhere, anyway, can see and can be touched by this very art. Now that is disruption. When it is accessible, when it's available, when it's anywhere, any place, anytime. So I'm going to contend as we talk about disrupting a market, there are three vectors that I want you to think about. And this will be then the theme of my talk, is these three vectors, and I'll prove to you, or at least hope to convince you, that these are the right vectors, and that these vectors are what's required for disruption, and if these three exist, then disruption will happen, and then all the good outcome will happen. So what are the three things? The very first thing that I would say is when you look at as a market changes, there are really two ways it can change. It can change incrementally. The product or service in that market gets faster, it gets better, or it gets cheaper, or some combination of those. It's a better mousetrap. It's a little bit faster, a little bit better, a little bit cheaper, a little bit easier, a little bit sexier, but it's an incremental improvement over what has already existed. The other way a market can change is through a massive disruption. This is not an incremental improvement. This is where the old is no longer viable and there is a completely new model. And that new model could be a new technology model, it could be a new economic model, or it could be a new social model, or a combination of those, where it fundamentally shifts the technology landscape, the economic landscape, or the social landscape. And if those three things happen, it's a disruptive change, and I argue a disruptive change will be longer lasting and more impactful than an incremental change. So that's one vector. The second that I will talk about is access. Access. So a lot of times it's not about the product itself, but it's about the access that product enables. And the more valuable the content, or more valuable the asset that the product enables access to, the more likely you've made a market shift or a disruptive shift that we're looking for. The third thing I'll talk about is speed. We now live in a world that is at hyperspeed. And you no longer have the Michelangelo effect of hundreds of years for a market impact to happen. It happens in instants of time. And I will give you examples and proof of that. So there are three things we'll talk about. We'll talk about disruptive versus incremental. We'll talk about access to assets beyond just the product itself. And the third thing we'll talk about is speed. So let's get to it. This is important for you to understand, and if you learn nothing that shocks your friends and family out of my talk tonight, this will, so use it. This is a Harvard Business School study, and occasionally Harvard Business School does something that's interesting. This is one of the studies they did, and what they did is they looked at Fortune 500 companies. Who are the Fortune 500? And the first thing they started, who is the Fortune 500 in 1945? And they compared that list to who is the Fortune 500 in 1990. So they looked at a 45-year period, and what they learned is something spectacular. 70% of the companies in the Fortune 500 in 1945 were in the Fortune 500 in the year 1990. So if 70% are in, that means 30% went away. They're no longer in the Fortune 500. So change happened in the leadership of categories, and you expect change, but it's not a big change. If you're a Fortune 500, you're a Fortune 500. So what happened in this next period? The next period was only a 25-year period. And what they found is if you looked at the Fortune 500 in 1990 and compared it to 2014, only 30% of the companies were in through that whole period. 70% of the companies that were in that Fortune 500 are no longer in. Nokia is an example. Motorola is an example. Nortel is an example. And if you think industry by industry, and you think, because I know all of you are much, much younger than I, you're all going, God, what was I buying in 1990? Who were the companies I aspired to be part of or to invest in? And where are those companies just last year? Likely 70% of them are gone. Are no longer in the Fortune 500. They've either been acquired, they've been absorbed, they've just gone away, they've been merged, whatever. They're no longer the same. Now, what's even more interesting, what is even more interesting is if we look at the next 25 years. So if I look from, next 10 years. So it went 45, 25, 10. And you look at the last 10 years that we're in now, that we're staring at, and you're thinking, where is my company? And if I'm one of those corporates, a third of you are in corporates, and if you're in one of those corporate companies, are you a leader today and will you be a leader tomorrow? Well, the odds are you're not. The odds are the company that you're at is in trouble. 10 years from now, you won't be around. Now, what's more interesting to me is not the negative. It's not the negative of, hey, 92% of us will be gone. What's more interesting is that 8%. What is it that you can do? What is it that you need to do at your company to be in the 8% that are still there and still in a leadership position, or take a leadership position in order to get there? That's the question you need to ask yourself. So let's talk about how did I think about that when I was at Netscape, or how did I think about that when I was jumping on the Android bandwagon before anybody else did, or why is banking the next, and what do you have to do to lead in banking? Well, I'm going to start with understanding where the world is going. And I don't think it's any great surprise that what the world wants to do is be able to utilize more sensory sources of information in order to make more intelligent decisions. Today, we are flooded with information. Big data is the hot new category to invest in. If you're a VC and you don't have at least some big data in your portfolio, you've made some huge mistake. There's some portfolio imbalance if you don't have that. But big data is only a means to an end. Who cares if I have tons and tons of data if I don't have the tools to be able to make use of it? So the trick is, who is going to run to the top of each industry, each market category, with the idea how to automate the intelligent use of big data? I picked a category we would all understand. We all sort of understand the idea of automobiles. This picture is literally taken outside my house. And every day I see a line of these cars go driving by my house in Silicon Valley. And what is this line of cars? These are called Google cars. Google, and now Apple, are going to reinvent, right, totally disrupt the automotive market. We thought that Elon Musk and Tesla made a great run at changing the definition of an automobile. That was just a scratch of the surface before we see what these Google cars and Apple cars are going to do. So what makes them so special? Well, if you look at the automobile looked like this in 1890-ish when Benz created the first car. And it looks like this today. The car I get in, I've got a beautiful car. I'm really excited by it. I get in, I sit in this car, and it looks just like this. I've got a rear view mirror. And the only source of input and decision making and control routes through me. And I decide if this car is going to turn left. I decide if this car is going to brake. I decide if this car is going to change the station on the radio. I'm the brain. And because I'm the brain, I can only process so much information using so much algorithm to make so much decision to control this vehicle. Now, if you actually got to sit inside those Google cars that went by my house, those Google cars look like this. On the pop-up dashboard, they're taking in sources from 100 sensors around the car. So what cars are around me? Where am I? What's the traffic situation? What are the lights? What are the alternate routes? I have all this, as well as anything I can connect to in the outside data world. So I can access applications. I can access data sources. I can access all this stuff. And that car is then processing algorithms, processing information, and making decisions faster than I could ever decide or want to do that. Now, I use simple automobile as the industry example. Think of your industry. What are the sources of data? What is the valuable decision making that could be done? And how could I apply those decisions to the device or to the product or to the service I'm going to provide? And I don't care if you're making pizzas, or I don't care if you're enabling me to try on clothes on the internet. The challenge is the same. The problem to solve is the same. So let me give you a context then to think about it. So what type of decisions do you want to help the buyers of your product or service do? Well, I'd say they're in three different categories. And it's one or more of these three categories you need to help them make better decisions about. The first, they're on the right, my right, your left, are economic factors. Different economic decisions. If I go here, will I get more? If I go there, will I spend less? Can I optimize for this versus that? And if you can meaningfully or significantly impact economic factors, that will create the change that will drive demand for your product in the future. The second is technological. If this is a technology that can enable other technologies to do better stuff in a different way. And the last is social. Right? And we're living in a world in which we're getting a greater social conscience. And does my product or service do good for mankind is increasingly important. When these three come together, it creates disruption. And disruption is what changes categories, reinvents industries. So let me finish on a very, very provocative thought. I want to list some important industries, and I want to challenge your mind. I start with fintech. And what I've done is this is mapped every single fintech firm in Europe. Big, medium, startup, they're all there. And the lines are the connections between networks of companies. Now, if you were a fintech company, your name would be up there and you could see the dynamic. And if this is what the world looks like in fintech in Europe, the question is, what moves do I make? How do I think about these things John talked about in order to become that market leader in 2020? Well, let me make it more precise. And let me tell you some of my heroes' thoughts around this. So I start with this guy, Darwin. And Darwin said something very interesting, that it's not about the strong, it's not about the fast, it's not about the rich, it's about the agile. It's about the person that could move and shift and change direction the fastest. So who are the companies that have done that and done it spectacularly? Here's something to think about. The world's leading media company, the greatest media owner in the world, does not produce a single piece of content. Think about this. The number one market cap transportation company in the world does not own a single vehicle. The world's largest hotelier, and I stay in hotels every week, yet the largest one, most valuable one in the world, does not have a single room on their books. This applies to retail. Think about the world's largest, most valuable retailer. I guess you'll bet with me, they don't have a single product in inventory. Do you see a theme here? Now think about you. Think about your business. Think about what you're doing, and what is it that you absolutely need to own, and what is it that's irrelevant? Because 10 years ago, who would have said the world's biggest media company would produce no content, the world's largest hotelier would have no rooms, the world's largest transportation company would have no vehicles? Well, in my category, I don't know who the Facebook or the Uber or the hotelier is. I hope it's me. I don't know. But I know that the world's largest provider of banking services will have no money. So I end on the thought, your industry, you're going to lead it in 2020. What will you not have? And I think if you go to bed and sleep off the beer using the hangover medicine I saw earlier, you'll surprise yourself that you won't have whatever product you think you're producing. Thank you very much.